Hello, and welcome to IMA's Inside Talk webinar series. The title of today's presentation is Planning for a Technological Transformation, sponsored by Oracle NetSuite. I'm Margaret Lockery, and I'll be your host for today's Inside Talk webinar. It's a pleasure to have Sue Kawaja as part of our program, and she will be serving as moderator for today's event. Sue is the Business Development Manager at IMA. Hi, Sue. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Margaret. And hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be part of the Inside Talk webinar series. And on behalf of IMA, I want to welcome everyone to today's session. At this time, I would like to introduce our featured presenter for today's program. With us today, we have Hamza Zia. Hamza Zia is the Director of Solution Architecture at Myers-Holum, where he's responsible for overseeing the solution architecture team and ensuring IT strategy is aligned with clients' current and future business goals. He has architected and implemented over 100 ERP implementations for both SMB and global enterprise clients in various industries such as manufacturing, distribution, food and beverage, NFPs, SaaS, and other softwares. You can learn more about Hamza in the speaker bio section of your console. Please join me in welcoming Hamza Zia. Now, before turning the presentation over to our speaker, I would like to go over the learning objectives for today's program. After participating in this webinar, you will be able to identify the steps needed to plan and execute for change. Should also be able to describe how to plan for every stage of ERP implementation. You will recognize where and how to apply change management. And finally, you will discover ways to enable your team and load balance a successful ERP implementation. We're looking forward to an informative presentation today. So at this time, I'm going to turn your attention to Hamza to begin.
Folks, it's great to be speaking with you here today. The premise of today's conversation is to really gear you all to essentially be poised to be successful in a technological transformation. I'll get into the specifics here in a second, but the overall agenda for today is just going to give you a little background about Myers-Holum, specifically why we are poised to be, put in place to be successful for any ERP implementation, specifically revolving around NetSuite. I'll talk about why the topic here is so important for everyone on the call, either immediately or in your future professional careers, because if majority of you will ultimately go through a technological transformation, whether it's revolving around ERP, small, special projects internally within your organization. So ultimately, the content here today could be applied to all those different facets. Within any special project or any ERP implementation, there's always going to be risk associated with that activity as well. So I'll essentially be talking about how to anticipate and adjust for that risk proactively rather than doing that reactively and filling in the blanks as you go along. So it all comes back to planning, and I'll talk about how specifically you can adjust for that as necessary. Then we'll kind of get into the topic of the bulk of today's content, which is really change management. Really, a lot of people see this as more of a buzzword, but there's more content and more substance behind change management. It can really be the driving factor to lead either a special project or an ERP implementation to that next level and keep that level of adoption going forward as well. So I'll identify specifically where in those regions change management can be applied. For example, in our case here, an ERP implementation, because it is unique and specialized to every single project. So identifying that in each stage of an ERP implementation is quite important. And then finally, we'll close out with any conclusion and key takeaways from this presentation. So let's start with an intro to Myers-Holum. I just want to kind of give a quick little backdrop about who Myers-Holum is and who is the company that I ultimately am representing here today. So Myers-Holum is essentially a boutique consulting firm based out in New York City. We've been in the ecosystem for 40 plus years, and our leadership is still essentially involved with the business. We focus on primarily NetSuite implementations, but that also includes an ecosystem surrounding NetSuite. So integrations, customizations, whether it's connecting to a data warehouse or data lake, or what that architectural strategy ultimately looks like for an organization that's going through this sort of a transformation. We're essentially consulting a shop to provide that level of detail while transforming the business as well from an actual tech stack standpoint, utilizing NetSuite as the actual hub or model to consolidate all the information into. We have over 350 plus consultants globally, so we focus on implementations not only in North America, but the EMEA, JPAC, Latin America regions. So we've experience with localized activity, specialized to certain areas within all over the world, excuse me. And then also we have industry expertise. So NetSuite, speaking to the breadth of the software, really allows almost any type of company to leverage the platform, whether you're a software company, whether you're a SaaS-based organization, whether you're a manufacturer, wholesale distributor, retail, not-for-profit, whatever it may be. The nimbleness of NetSuite can cater to each one of those different verticals as we like to consider them. And we have extensive experience with 1,000+ clients in our portfolio. And then finally, we are a NetSuite award-winning partner. We've been awarded multiple times as Partner of the Year by Oracle themselves, who we fall under as NetSuite from a hierarchy standpoint. And then finally, we are a full-service firm at Myers. So we're really responsible for not just the functional consulting needs and wants of certain clients, but ultimately the customizations, the integrations, the potential tech stack of what the future model looks like, right? That full service shop is what we focused on here at Myers. Now, there's one key aspect to the conversation here today, ultimately the railroad tracks I want to focus on. And that's really that first band that you see there, the ERP implementation. I think it's quite important for us to frame the conversation to ultimately understand, okay, this is what we're going to be talking about and how it ultimately aligns to, in our use case here, an ERP implementation. So just to put it into context, generally an ERP implementation follows these specific 6 steps or stages that you see here. The first one really is the initiate phase, and that's really where all the planning operations happen from the SI or solution provider like MyersHolum with the client to make sure we're aligning on project goals, timelines, catering to all the necessary needs necessary, and putting a plan or in motion to ultimately move to the next step here, which is quite important when we consider that the analyze phase. Now, this analyze phase is where we would sit down with the client, understand the core process needs for example, procurement, supply chain, the financial consolidation potentially, right? And ultimately detail that out in something we call a business requirements document. This BRD or business requirements document is essentially the blueprint that we would use to build the system out appropriately in that next step that you see there. And ranging on the complexity of the project and the size of the project, immediate needs for potential phasing as well, to get boots out on the ground immediately for our clients to realize their ROI. It could be, this build phase could be a mere, 2 months to 6 months on an average approximation. But ultimately, we're using that BRD to determine and drive what the system is going to look like. The next step really is the validate phase, where we test the system out with the client. If there's integrations at play, we're making sure we're testing that out. If there are certain unique processes that our clients have, we're testing that out appropriately. And then finally, we get more so into the latter half of the implementation. Convert is generally where we train the end users who are involved with the project if they have not already been intertwined into the details prior. And then finally, we have the optimize phase, supporting our clients as they move forward with the overall implementation, okay? So the reason why I wanted to, again, outline this is because change management, which is a big focus of today's conversation, and risk as well, is immediate in every single one of these stages. So being able to isolate this and frame the conversation for everyone to understand how we're going to be positioning the conversation today, it's off of these railroad tracks, okay? So why is this topic important, right? So ERP is fundamental to essentially all organization, whether you're on QuickBooks, which is a very simplistic, ERP, if you want to consider it that, or if you're on NetSuite or SAP or Epicor, these are all kind of ERPs in the ecosystem that a lot of the times we see overall that our clients either wean off of or we're having consulting compete with from a NetSuite standpoint. But as I mentioned this earlier as well, almost every single person within this webinar has either potentially already gone through an ERP implementation and understands kind of the needs and pain points and potentially optimizational efforts that came about from it, or will be going through one. So, you know, essentially you'll be able to take away a lot from this conversation and apply that for your future goals, whether it's an ERP implementation or, again, as I mentioned, more of a special project that's happening internally. And ERP has become more prevalent in the last, I would say, 2-3 years, more than ever. During the time frame of COVID, we saw an exponential boom in our specific business. And the reason for that was because there was more necessary need for collaboration, specifically in COVID's case, remote collaboration. So a lot of our companies that we onboarded within that time frame needed to modernize the way that they were actually performing their operations, whether it was supply chain, finance, procurement, whatever it may be. ERP was that consolidating hub that we ultimately blurred the lines for, you know, these Chinese walls or siloed walls that were up for a lot of our clients prior to create more of a end-to-end model to drive personal efficiency for a lot of our clients. Okay. And then finally, just one of the largest barriers to a successful ERP implementation, and again, coming back to this, is the change management side of things. So as we adopt a new ERP, there's going to be folks that ultimately, you know, are going to have a very hard time breaking away from tradition. And a big portion of today's conversation is to identify those risks and be able to accommodate that into the overall ERP implementation process. Amazing. So just to provide a quick couple of stats, right? I already mentioned this relative to COVID, but the ERP market share has been more than doubling every single year. It's currently valued at approximately a 39 billion plus or minus mark, but it's projected to grow to about 86 billion by 2027. And again, this kind of speaks to the fact that as we move away from this brick and mortar type of society to more of a digitized one, companies and organizations and IP is ultimately going to be moving more so, if more than ever, towards the technological side of things, where it's modernized in the cloud, more importantly. And again, NetSuite is a key leader to drive that growth for a lot of our small to medium-sized organizations that fall within that 5 to under $1 billion mark. Now, to kind of paint a stark picture, out of that, you know, 39 billion mark currently of market share, it is noted that approximately 55 to 75% of those ERP implementations are considered a failure. Now, how we measure this failure is subjective. So I will say that, you know, one person could consider failure for this implementation. Either it could be a change management deliverable, or it could be, hey, that client never actually went live. So there's multiple facets to this specific criteria that you see here, but ultimately, you know, majority of the times people see an ERP implementation as a hindrance. Now, to drive that ultimate, you know, drive this statistic in a better light, what I wanted to do here is to essentially provide you folks the high level, before we get into the specifics, of factors that drive a successful versus a failed implementation, right? And the best way to categorize this and summarize it in a way where it's consumable is by 3 buckets, right? What happens before an implementation, what happens during an implementation, and post-implementation that could drive some of those subjective factors, like I mentioned, for a failed ERP implementation, so that ultimately you all can take that and apply that to your future projects. So when it comes to the pre-implementation planning side of things, any project, any ERP implementation requires extensive planning operations. So in our case here, from a pre-implementation planning standpoint, we work with clients to understand their resourcing and load balancing efforts, right? at the end of the day, the partner that you're working with, that's their day job. For example, NetSuite implementations and architecture is my day job. But for a lot of our clients, they have to balance that level of effort with their actual day job, which could be that they're a controller or they're a supply chain manager, et cetera. So a big portion of that is to be able to load balance and working with the implementation partner that you've ultimately chosen or positioned to break out what the week-over-week allocation essentially could look like is a key attribute to drive success for you guys going forward, because there could be certain peaks and troughs associated with potentially backfilling a certain position, or someone may potentially go on paternity leave, right? So being able to foresee that in the future, anticipate that risk, and build that into the overall timeline is very important in the pre-implementation planning side. In the mid-implementation, a majority of the times what we see is that everyone wants everything, right? And as you move to a new system, controlling that scope is extremely important. So the 80-20 principle is an incredible model to kind of use here, where 80% of what the needs are and the wants are is something that we should ultimately position, and then whatever the necessary wants are, more of a nice to have, is something we position for a phase 2. Right? So just living by this rule is extremely important during the mid-implementation stage. There's also aspects such as inadequate testing, change management, and training, which we'll get into here today, and more importantly, implementation fatigue, which are key proponents to making sure that the overall project is moving in the right direction by ultimately tailoring the conversation in the appropriate 80-20 rule principle, coming back to that. And then finally, I'll just close out with this, is just the post-implementation side of things, where we want to make sure that all the work that we've essentially done for our client remains and stays. And that goes back to the fact of reinforcing the overall true principles that we put in place by allowing these users to be comfortable and confident with the overall implementation and their specific activities that are happening within NetSuite. So I'll turn it over to Sue here for our first poll question.
Great, thank you, Hamza. Attendees should see the first poll question now open on your screen. If you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, which should correct the issue. I would like to remind all participants that you may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on your screen. Our first polling question is, have you been part of any ERP or other major technology implementation in your professional career? Your options are A, yes, or B, no. Please note that after selecting an answer, you must click the Submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen, just below the response option, in order for us to successfully record your answer. And with that, I believe we have a majority of the responses in, so we can look at the results.
Perfect. So you can already see that a lot of you have already kind of gone through an ERP implementation. So there's ultimately lessons learned that have already been put in place for the operations that you've essentially gone through. So a lot of the volumes that we're going to be speaking to here today are either going to be contrasting activities to say, hey, we could have done that better, or for some of those folks like the 18% who have not gone through it, or even the 82% that have gone through it, you can take what the core key principles are here today and say, oh, you know what, that specifically needs change management to be put in place so we can break away from tradition for that isolated activity. Because I see there's a potential risk to the overall end goal, and that's us going live on a certain date. Great. So a big aspect of any implementation is anticipating and adjusting for the overall risk associated with, again, those different milestones that we have with the project, whether it's initiate, analyze, build, validate, convert, or optimize that we talked about earlier. And these are generally the key, project risks and the countermeasures that come into play when it comes to those specific stages. I know it's a little bit of a busy slide, but we're going to be focusing on key project risks just for today's conversation. The first one really is the executive commitment. the executive commitment is extremely important to make sure that we have appropriate leadership saying this is a good change for the organization, and ultimately that needs to be pushed from top down as needed. It needs to be organic, it needs to be genuine, right? So what we do from our side, or any implementation partner, or potentially hiring a change management consultant to come in, is to build the overall communication plan that would be then distributed from top down within your organization from leadership. And this could be quarterly newsletters. This could be, hey, this is what's happening from a transparency standpoint of where we are at in the implementation, right? Just making sure that everyone is aware that there's a major aspect or transformation happening, and this is how we are essentially catering to it with the specialized team who's working on it, right? A second key project risk that I always see is requirements definition. Now, requirements definition is, as I mentioned, in the analyze phase, where we sit down with the client to understand the core operations with the entire business. Now, there's absolutely no way where if we're just sitting down with a client, we understand 100% of the resources right from the start. It's impossible, right? But generally, a 75 to 80% hit rate of gathering the major attributes with any implementations or major nuances with any transformation is extremely important. Because if we can understand that delta that exists with the requirements that we did not capture will naturally just come about through the implementation process, and that's completely fine. But to curb this specific risk, it is extremely important to introduce and keep the business process owners, as we like to call it, or department heads, if you want to consider them that way, into the implementation, specifically revolving around the requirements gathering, because they know their department and specific, part of their operations the best. So if there's any nuances, if there's any major gaps that may exist, we're able to identify and outline them, ultimately driving our risk down for those future aspects of the implementation. Okay. Another one that I constantly see is scope creep. Every time you have an implementation or ERP system being put in place, people get really excited, and that's an incredible activity to have included in all of our projects. We want that, but with that also comes a risk, which is, hey, we talked about this specific feature, and I want that, or I want this specific feature to be added in phase one as well. Right? And it just constantly compounds and compounds and compounds. So to be able to control that, you really have to silo, as I mentioned earlier, a need versus an actual want. What is necessary in terms of need for us to go live in this phase one without deterring, goals for not only just my department, but the subsequently other departments that are involved with the implementation, and ultimately what is considered a want, something that we can position for a phase two that we could continue doing manually in phase one. That delineation is extremely important, and curbing that from a risk mitigation standpoint is really going to help a lot of team members going forward, because you can get really carried away with this and the system could be unusable in the most dire situations for a lot of our clients. So having a strong pillar within the organization to drive this, whether it's a project manager or someone within the organization that is considered an expert from the implementation partner standpoint, is very important. Okay, and then finally, data readiness. I'm sure for all those 80% of the people that answered the first poll question, data readiness is one of the most important pieces that you could ever involved in an ERP implementation or technological transformation project, right? These systems that are procured by organizations essentially are a database that are moving information to point A to point B appropriately. So the data that you put in is extremely important. So working with the implementation partner on the appropriate data strategy is a key attribute to your success, and ultimately what can drive risk down. So rather than, saying, yep, we'll just export the information from our current systems and put it into our new ERP system and just figure it out after, is a terrible aspect to kind of just roll down with. It is extremely important to detail out sample data understand how you can optimize that, given that it's coming into a new system. So this is, an IMA specific webinar. So if you consider a GL, right, you don't necessarily need 10 different AP accounts. You could generally have 1 or 2 AP accounts, and the other accounts could be other current liability accounts, right? Same thing on the AR side. So working through that data as a way to optimize the future operations within a new ERP are extremely important. So making sure that you work through step-by-step approaches on data readiness and cleanup will only benefit you down the road, so you don't have to rework the system and work against it in a sense as well. There's a host of other project risks here, folks, but just in the interest of time, just understand that there's always going to be a countermeasure to a risk that exists. All you need to do is identify that early on and watch for it, so that way we can be proactive as opposed to reactive. Defining project team structures is also extremely important. We kind of tiptoed around this throughout the entire presentation, but just to essentially put a visual, right? Whenever you're going through an implementation or a technological transformation, whether it's small or at a global scale, you have to define what that hierarchy looks like. So just hyper-focusing on the top section here, you generally have your steering committee, which is making sure that the overall implementation is moving in the right direction. If there needs to be any change management communication that's happening, it's coming from top down. And then finally, you have more of a flat structure associated with your project managers, functional consultants, and more of a system administrator or architect from the client side. That's fine. Everything's great there. But again, the more important piece is those business process owners or client business participants that you see on the bottom left. These are isolated departments that ultimately will have a lead or a business process owner associated with that initiative who is detailing the 90%. This is what we require. This is what, why we require it. And they ultimately have end users that fall within that to drive some of the end-to-end testing walkthrough activity with a certain functional area. So for example, if you focus on the finance and accounting side, there is generally one way to enter in a journal entry, but there may be specific nuances with approvals associated with a journal entry. So them detailing that out to us is a major aspect potentially for SOX compliance, right, if they're a public company. So being able to identify that and work with these business participants from a hierarchical structure not only defines the requirements, but also the level of involvement from a change management and lead standpoint, because we want that project business process owner lead to actually push that level of work down and communication down to these end level resources to be able to drive the efficiency and, again, break away from the tradition or manual intervention that they may revert back to if that is not the case. Okay, perfect. So now we're coming up to our second poll question, and I'll turn it back to Sue here.
Thank you, Hamza. Attendees should see the second poll question now open on your screen. If you cannot see the poll question, please refresh your browser, which should correct the issue. I would like to also, again, remind all participants that you may begin responding to each question as soon as it appears on your screen. Our second poll question is, if you have experienced an ERP implementation, was the implementation considered a success for your organization? Your options are A, a success, B, partial success, C, partial failure, or option D, a failure, or option E, not yet experienced an ERP implementation. Please note that after selecting an answer, you must click the Submit button, which is located on the right side of the screen, just below the response option. And with that, Hamza, we can click on the next and see how our attendees responded.
Amazing. So it looks like a lot of the folks on the call here today have seen either success or partial success with an ERP implementation, which is great news, meaning that a lot of the core key principles that we either talked about today have been applied or could be applied in the future for some of the partial failures, failure in general. or don't have experience with an ERP, again, you can apply those more intertwined with what the future goal looks like. But this is great news and maybe puts the overall 55 to 75% statistic to shame, which is great, great news. So now we get into more of the meat and potatoes here, folks, about how to identify when to actually apply change management, right? So change management is more than just a key buzzword or a communication model. It's really to enable, it's an enabling framework, I should say, to manage the people side of change. So rather than, as I mentioned, it being more of a communication model, it is considered more of a support model to define what the current state looks like and work towards the future state of a project, where understanding the needs to influence each resource who is involved with the project to adopt the change successfully, and then reinforce and keep that change moving forward as well. Okay, and there's multiple aspects of how we can do this, but overall, you know, it always comes back to just making sure that we're preparing, enabling to drive that adoption end to end for our clients. And change management is unique to every single organization. So what we're going to be discussing today is really just the framework. You know, the folks on the call here today, you guys know the overall culture, you know the overall nuances potentially to your organization. So you have to tailor those specific attributes to the model here, but ultimately this general flow from a support perspective is going to be able to aid in getting to that end goal. Here we get to our third poll question. Sue, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Hamza. Attendees should see the third poll question now open on your screen. Our third poll question is, what have you found to be the key factor in success change management? Please select all that applies. Your options are A, project planning, B, through requirements, B, thorough requirements, C, key stakeholder engagement, D, communication, like project scope, rollout, strategy, and schedule, or option E, all of the above. Please be sure to click the submit button, which is located again on the right side of your screen, so we can successfully record your answers. And with that, I actually would like to ask you a question here, Hamza. From your experience, at what stage of ERP implementation did you typically experience a fail or not a successful implementation?
So I would say it's right when the anxiety levels for a lot of our clients start to go up, and that's right before we actually go live. And that just speaks to the fact, and that's normal. I will say that you know, you're moving towards a project and you're about to go live and everything's becoming real in a sense. So being able to curb that by having the appropriate testing strategy being put in place and vetting the system to, again, get to that 80-20 rule appropriately is very important. After that, it really is just kind of putting the implementation on autopilot, because you've done everything that you could, and it's not going to be perfect. And clients need to understand that it's not going to be rainbows and butterflies, but again, utilizing that 80-20 principle, majority of what you're looking for is going to be there, ready to use. And then it's a continuous kind of optimization model to make sure that we're identifying what those key facets or levers that we need to pull up and down to make sure that we do get to the 100% mark right after the optimized phase. So that there's a small period where there's a little bit of uncertainty, but again, very normal. And we're just working through that periodically.
Great, thank you so much, Hamza. And we can go to the next slide.
Perfect. So it seems like it's all the above, which is very, very true. Project planning, thorough requirements, key stakeholder engagement, communication plans coming from bottom up and top down are extremely important to the success of the implementation, because each one of those facets that you see there are ultimately defined for that railroad track that we talked about earlier, the entire project itself, and applying these specific metrics in those certain deliverables and stages. So now we'll get into the model itself. So the AdCar model is a very prominent model in the change management ecosystem, and it's really used to drive change within an organization while limiting that resistance to change. And that's extremely important, right? And I can just kind of go off here and name this acronym, but the goal of today is to really be able to allow you all to identify when and how to apply this specific model to your careers, number one, or to the special project you're working on, or the overall ERP implementation. So we'll get into what each one of these letters essentially mean and give clear examples on that as well. But the main point that I do want to just drive across here is that this is an outcome-specific model. So it's really going to allow the user who is ultimately administrating this for the organization to identify where that specific end user is in the change management lifecycle. So what I mean by that, just to put it into simplistic terms, is, for example, resource A may be aware that the change is happening, while resource B, who's someone who's completely different, is already aware of the change, but they just don't know how, or they don't have the knowledge specifically to apply it. And how we combat this is by essentially having assessments, AdCar assessments, throughout the implementation, so we can isolate that individual appropriately and make sure that they are all kind of adhering to the same timeline, and we can work on those individuals independently. Okay, so just to kind of put that into perspective, this is an example of an AdCar assessment at the end of the day. But just to quickly outline each one of these, awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and enforcement, each one of these kind of letters here, I just want to detail it out very specifically. So for the awareness side of things, this is really alerting those resources that a change is coming. Now, how you deliver this is extremely important. So put it into context of an ERP implementation, you want to make the statement, hey, we're going to be initiating an ERP implementation, and NetSuite is potentially the poised solution that we're going to be positioning. That's your statement, right? But then you need to drive the fact home that there's a problem statement of why we're essentially doing this. So our problem statement in this use case is that many departments potentially have expressed the concern of, the collaboration between Department A and Department B has really been siloed, and we can't get to the end goal between operations and finance, hypothetically. So that's a problem statement. And then the solution to that specific outcome is that, hey, we've heard what you guys have told us essentially, and ultimately we've isolated this problem, and the ERP can solve this by tying back the work order or manufacturing operation back to the subledger within NetSuite, so finance is aware of all the minute transactions that are happening, right? The solution to that problem for that specific department. So depending on how granular you want to get with the project, the application of actually making resources aware in this systematic approach of statement, problem, solution is very, very important rather than just a blanket statement, right? The second really is that desire to change. Now, depending on the resources, this doesn't always mean that if the desire is there that they're going to be able to adopt it, right? And to really make sure that we're double downing on the desire for change, this comes back to leadership. Leadership has to drive home that this adoption is a good avenue for the organization, and it's coming from top down. So defining that key implementation team structure that we talked about earlier is extremely important, because if you've identified certain areas or certain departments that don't necessarily have the desire to change, great, you've identified that risk and can now apply the appropriate change management communications to drive that desire to that end state. Okay. Then really we get to the knowledge side of things, right? The main factor that I just want to drive home here, and it's very simple, is that you just need to have transparency, ultimately education, which ties that all back into training. So just making sure that the users who are involved with the project, you're understanding how they learn and be able to have that level of application relative to their learning style for that special project. So what we see from our standpoint for more of our manufacturing clients, for example, is that they like us to be boots on the ground. They want us to come on site. They want us to walk through the shop floor with them and be able to identify this is where the potential gap is, right? So classroom style type of operations is more catered towards their learning, whereas opposed to a SaaS company, they don't necessarily have that type of model. So we can definitely use kind of remote learning or pre-recorded videos to cater to their specific needs and asks. So just understanding the different levels and breadths of who the resource is, type of organization, culture is extremely important, and then comes back to that point that I mentioned earlier, where this is just a model. You have to really tailor this appropriately to that end resource and organization at the end of the day, right? Ability, just wrapping up the conversation here, is all about confidence, right? Everything that we're doing from that railroad track functionality that we talked about earlier is making sure that these resources are aware that a change is coming, that they have the desire, they have the knowledge. So we've systematically gone through testing with them. We've gone through requirements gathering. They've been a part of this process, right? So now it's all about making sure that they have the confidence now to carry forward with that as we take the training wheels off. So it is extremely important to not just apply this ability aspect at the tail end of the implementation. This has to be something that's done continuously, very strategically throughout the process to make sure that the resources that are involved with the actual ERP transformation have provided their input, have tested the system, have trained now with the system, and can potentially train other users through a train the trainer model, and then finally be able to stand up on their own 2 feet and drive what the implementation is going to look like for a phase 2, phase 3 as well, right? And that, again, just ties back to the reinforcement side of things. Just want to make sure that the overall changes that we're putting in place are reinforced and stay. So a lot of the times we see people reverting back to their old ways of doing things. So having a correctiveness approach there, and again, that's tailored to the culture and organization of organization itself, while also kind of putting together what we've seen as a points model, right? So if you do this specific, end-to-end use case in the appropriate way that the SI has implemented, you get a $10 gift card to Macy's or something like that, right? So it could be as simple as that. But more importantly, we just want to make sure that we correct certain shortcuts and reinforce good end-to-end solutions that the SI has built for the overall client. Okay, but this AdCar assessment is essentially happening throughout the implementation. This isn't something that we just do at the beginning and at the tail end. We need to be proactive and ultimately address the needs of every single resource, or at least the departments, if it's a large-scale implementation, to be able to identify and adjust as necessary. Okay, this is just putting a bow on the conversation here that we just talked about with some examples, right? So you can see the overall timeline at the top. You can see the OCM deliverables that we've already talked about here today, and some of the approaches as well. So in the awareness side of things, at the beginning part of the implementation, there's a lot of town hall meetings, newsletters, just communication plans to say this is what's happening and this is how we're going to be doing it. The build phase is the desire, making sure that they have reference guides, see design documents. Transparency is key here so they can feel more involved. The validate phase, here we do all the pre-recorded videos for certain clients. Convert is actually instructor-led training. And then finally, optimization is more revolved around reinforcement and just making sure that we have some sort of a model in place that is going to curb risk away or creating unnecessary shortcuts. So now we get to the fourth poll question. I'll turn it over to you, Sue.
Thanks, Hamza. Attendees now should see the fourth poll question open on your screen. And once again, if you cannot see the question, please refresh your browser. Our fourth and final poll question is your organization culture flexible enough to adopt change? Your options are A, yes, B, no, or C, I'm not sure. Please be sure to click the submit button so we can record your response here. And let me also remind participants to send us your questions and comments by typing them into the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. And with that, let's see how we're doing. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide and see how they responded.
So this is great news. A lot of the organizations that the attendees here work for have a flexible enough environment to adopt this change, and that's important, right? But looking at the most pessimistic side of the view, if, for example, you are really part of that 11% or 23% that's unsure, it is really important for you to test the waters in a sense. So either put together a plan to say, hey, this is a potential change that's going to be coming. What are your thoughts? Get a survey out there, really perform that assessment in a sense to ensure that if there are any potential risks with certain key resources, you can hyper-focus on them. Or if it's an organization-wide resistance to change, that's something that constitutes a larger conversation with leadership to be involved. But generally, these are some of the attributes that you can kind of instill to ensure that even if your organization is not flexible enough, there's certain ways of how you can get them there in an appropriate time to then position a major transformation such as an ERP implementation. Awesome. So now we really get to the tail end of today's conversation. Is really the conclusion and key takeaways. The three main things that I just want to reiterate are essentially that there's risk involved with anything, whether it's an ERP implementation, whether it's a special project, whether it's just an overall relationship that you have with your solution provider, which could potentially be Myers-Holum, right? The most important aspect is to just understand that there's going to be risk, be proactive in outlining what you think may be a risk, and coming up with a countermeasure in the pre-planning side of things, right? And majority of the times, picking the appropriate solution provider is going to allow you to curb majority of that risk right from the start, which is great, right? Because there's a lot of things that you just won't know going through a very specialized project, such as an ERP implementation. For example, you may not be experts on NetSuite, but the SI or the solution provider is, right? But there's certain things that the solution provider does not know about the organization that you will know much better, such as the flexibility of culture and the flexibility to actually be able to change, right? Those are things that inherently an outsider looking in just won't know. So being able to identify that for us is going to be a two-way street to make sure that both teams are successful. The second really is just, every organization is different. So every organization essentially has different business goals. The same thing applies for change management. You can't use the model that we talked about here today and just apply it to the organization from the exact use cases and examples that we used. It has to be tailored to the needs, wants, and again, culture, potential nuances of that organization. But the fundamental framework is something that you can definitely use to keep on the right path, right? And then finally, coming back to this because it's so important, is the 80-20 rule and identifying and isolating what is actually a core requirement for a need, a necessity. Without this, the operations can't run, or a want. This is a nice shiny thing that I want for the ERP implementation, but it's not a necessity, right? Ultimately, that can hinder us from the end goal, as I mentioned, which is going live on a certain date successfully. So being able to just balance that appropriately, but not being able to just push away things to the side is also extremely important. Even though it's a want, there has to be a way to ultimately cater to that in a phase one, whether it's a simple report, whether it's a report that you can then take into Excel and do the necessary calculations off of. There has to be an end-to-end solution for even the wants, but it's important that you have that on the roadmap as an optimization tool or optimization task. Perfect. So here we really reached the end. We've gone, the evaluation surveys popped up here, but Sue, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Hamza. Attendees should see the evaluation survey now open on your screen. If it did not open, please click the evaluation survey icon at the bottom of your screen for access. We appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey while we address some of the audience's questions. So we got a lot of questions. I'm going to try my best to get to most of them. The first question is actually going to be, what happens if we have identified a risk to where we cannot allocate enough resources to the project for it to be successful?
Yeah, so when it comes to that, it is extremely important that you've identified that risk right from the start. And it's now, you have to put rubber to the road in terms of working with your implementation partner to carve out the overall week-over-week allocation. What do you expect the timeline to look like? And what do you expect our resources from a finance perspective, from a supply chain perspective, from an end user perspective in terms of week-over-week allocation to this project to look like? And that way you can identify the peaks and the troughs with an implementation. And ultimately, worst case scenario, you can backfill those certain positions as needed. But overall, getting a clear understanding in the planning stages of the week-over-week allocation is extremely important. We do that, for example, for projects that range from $20,000 all the way up to your multi-million-dollar ones, right? So having that transparency is key.
Okay, so another question is, can you provide tips for getting buy-in from the executive team?
Great question. So when it comes to getting buy-in from the executive team, it is extremely important to essentially have a plan in place. And generally, this plan is something that the team, the core team within the organization won't be able to put together all on their own, right? So when it comes to selecting an actual ERP, that's a major task. So being able to put together the appropriate framework before you actually select one is extremely important, such as an RFI, an RFP. This is our problem set. This is what we're looking for in something that's new. And using that as the baseline core criteria to then move to a conversation of having a conversation with an SI such as Myers-Holum to define a plan, a preemptive plan, and that plan jointly taking what you have already established within the organization, coupling that and taking that to leadership could be that first step if buy-in is a little bit hard to get involved right from the start.
Okay, so our next question is, from your experience, what project management methodology is best for ERP implementation?
Yeah, so at Myers-Holum, we generally use a blend of Waterfall and Agile. And the reason for that is because we want to be able to adhere to the overall requirements for a client, especially in the volatility that exists within an ERP implementation. So we don't want to essentially silo away certain requirements and say, nope, we're going to be focusing on these in a phase 2 in a certain way or fashion. We want to be able to accommodate that, hear them out, and be able to build that into the project plan if necessary. So in my opinion, my personal experiences from doing hundreds of implementations and architecting over 1,000 is extremely important to have that blend between Agile and Waterfall to be able to meet the specific needs of clients flexibly.
So staying on the topic of Waterfall and Agile, there was a question on if you can provide one or two pros and cons of each from your experience.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Waterfall side of things, I would say the pro of a Waterfall, just that comes right to mind, is that as you finish a certain task, you have a clear line of path for what the next one is going to look like. So there's a very systematic step-by-step approach to move from one task to another, right? When it comes to the Agile side of things, sometimes people get bogged down in the fact of we need to complete all of these tasks from a sprint perspective, and we can only move forward once we finish all of these tasks. So if you can identify which is going to be appropriate for you guys and have potentially some protocols being put in place, in my opinion, is extremely important. And that's why coming back to that blend of Agile and Waterfall is important, because you can still focus on a phase 2 while still completing some of the more Agile, sprint-related activities for that certain phase of the implementation. While not just limiting and saying, hey, we're going to be just staying on this specific sprint. Once it's finished, we'll move on to the second sprint in Agile. you have bilateral kind of engagements happening here that are mixed.
All right, so our next question is, for the risk of placing too much reliance on consultants, specifically your system integration partner, how do you ensure you have the right balance between business leadership ownership and allowing the SI to do the job you hired them to do?
Yeah, so we see this quite a bit. When it comes to the reliancy on the actual ERP implementation partner, this is a tough one because it really comes back to the confidence side of things. Personally, for the engagements that I've been a part of, been able to architect and ultimately drive end to end, there's a fair amount of hand-holding that you have to do, right, at the beginning of the implementation. The SI or implementation partner has to be confident enough in the client and their abilities to be able to take their foot off the gas pedal slowly throughout the implementation to ultimately have that balancing effort of core responsibility from the client as opposed to the actual implementation consultant as we progress through the implementation, right? So an example of that I could generally see is that when we actually walk through the system with a client, I've already started to take my foot off the gas pedal a little bit, and I give them the option to say, hey, I would love if you drive the actual, end-to-end scenarios today, and I'll be hovering over your shoulder to make sure that you are comfortable enough with the process as we progress and move forward. So I've slowly started to give them one of the AdCar principle and models, which is the ability or the confidence to be able to actually put that in motion, which they can then continue forward for the testing side of things, right? Because they will be on their own for that, having someone over their shoulder. So just identifying the appropriate stage for where an SI or implementation partner can slowly take their feet off the gas pedal to allow them to be self-sufficient is what I would recommend as the biggest item to look out for as the end client.
Great. Thank you so much, Hamza, once again. With that, I am now going to turn attendees' attention back to our host, Margaret.
Thank you, Sue. At this time, I'd like to thank our presenter, Hamza Zia, for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. We're very appreciative that he's made time for IMA and for our audience today. And also, thank you, Sue Kawaja, for moderating today's event. I want to again thank Oracle NetSuite for sponsoring today's webinar and thank all of you for your participation in today's event, your commitment to IMA, and your professional development through IMA's Insight Talk webinar series. I look forward to spending time with you again soon when we'll enjoy some more Insight Talk.